I might now hand over to you, Lynne, as the leader of the next session, chairperson, and oh, we're there. Oh.
Thanks, Peter, and you're joining us on the panel. Please bring your clicker. I'll just move so you can get in. Thanks. I'm very pleased to be able to introduce to you a panel of very diverse people from different perspectives. I'm going to just very, very briefly introduce them and give you sort of a context for what we're trying to achieve in this panel. Before I do that, could I ask you to go into your blue plastic folder and take out your blue sheet for session number 2, which is on connecting career development with workforce development. And I see that many of you already have. So that's wonderful, because we want you again to be using the input from the panelists as a chance for you to reflect on what does this mean to you and make some notes that you'll want to discuss in your working groups. So if you have that in front of you, that would be wonderful. So just some very brief words about the panelists, and they're going to present in the order in which I'll introduce them. I don't think you need to be introduced to Peter Tatham, but when he is not running international symposia, he does have another place in the world where he is he's manager of the careers services at the University of Tasmania, and he's also the president of the Career Industry Council of Australia, CICA, which is a coalition of state, obviously I'm from Canada, of state and national associations who are all coming together in a single body to look collectively at issues that impact on the profession as a whole, and also try to leverage more attention with policy people and on issues even around the reform agenda. So Peter, just a little bit more about you. Great. We have Dr. Wendy Hirsh with us, and Wendy is, and some of you may have heard Wendy at the AACC. She gave a keynote there, which was one of the highlights of the AACC. Wendy gives a very different and interesting perspective. She is an independent researcher in employee and management development with business, with large business and small business in the UK. She's also a visiting professor at Kingston University. And she writes many good articles that when you're looking for really wonderful things to use and how you argue and make the case. I don't know how many times I've quoted your work, Wendy, and things I try to write to make the case more clearly about our place in workplace issues. So welcome, Wendy. Thanks for being here. Third, we have Dr. Mary McMahon. And Mary is pretty synonymous with career development in Australia, I would say. She is an author, very well-known author internationally, and publisher. Just has a new book out that she has edited, as I understand. We looked for it in the bookstore yesterday, but it's not there yet, Mary, so we have to get it. And Mary is also a lecturer at the University of Queensland and really combines theory and practice very well. She's a scholar and a really practical trainer and builder of people. So welcome, Mary. Thank you. And finally, we have Dr. Sue Richardson, who again brings a quite different perspective, one that we often don't hear enough in our profession, I think. She comes as a labor economist. And, we're often don't pay enough attention to what labor economists have to say. In addition to working on a labor economist agenda, she is with the National Institute of Labor Studies. She is also the president of the Academy of the Social Sciences in Australia. And when I was looking at the website, I was intrigued by a book that she had written called Living Decently. So I just thought it was a wonderful title, and it really intrigued me about I want to read it. So welcome to the panel. The panelists are each going to have a maximum of 12 minutes. And so I'm going to look, I have a watch. So I will give you all a 2-minuter when you're at 10, and we will stick to that because we want to make sure that you have good time for discussion. Just a brief note about, what am I doing wrong? Oh, sorry. About the context for we want this panel to sort of take an umbrella view, to look at the big picture of how do we connect career development with workforce development. So it's really an overview perspective. Career services are, in most of our countries, being increasingly asked to respond positively to very specific workforce challenges. For many years, we were responding to lifelong learning challenges, but there is an increasing emphasis on looking at what contribution do we really make practically to advancing workforce objectives, and very specific things like what is our response to skill shortages? Do we fit into that? When employers have huge labor issues, are we part of the solution to that? So looking at, I think sometimes the connections are not necessarily clear to all of us in our own minds who practice in this field, and often are not clear to our stakeholder groups, whether they be policy or the employer community or business or labor. So this is really about kind of raising big picture issues from the perspective of, let's just look at the connection from different points of view between career development and workforce development. And then following this sort of umbrella, we will, as Peter outlined, be looking more at strands as we move through. What does it mean for young people? What does it mean for others? But this is really kind of an umbrella session to set the stage. So with your blue pages in front of you, I'm just going to turn it to the panel and invite Peter to begin to speak. And you don't have PowerPoints, Peter, so you don't need this. You need to wait 5 seconds till this. And we'll turn it to Peter and over you.
Thanks very much, Lynne. Is that working? Okay. I've been asked to focus on career development and policy challenges. It'll be a slightly different version than Helen's. Policy is more than a statement of intent. It shapes career practice, and if done well, gets all of the stakeholders to focus on the same question in the same way. That question is how to reshape career development so it can more effectively contribute to workforce development. The issue is complex in part because if the beneficiary is the individual, why should government and industry contribute? If the beneficiary is the industry and government, why should the individual get involved in national economic concerns? So it's a bit of both. I'll speak from the point of the Career Industry Council of Australia, CICA. CICA represents 12 associations, as I mentioned last night, and through them about 4,600 career practitioners. CICA has a vision for a career development culture in Australia, and we've been keen to work with governments and employers to build an understanding of the value of career development. Organisations like CICA, it's a voluntary organisation, represent what is emerging, according to Terry Moran and Helen Silver, as a new paradigm in policy development, one based on partnerships and shared intelligence. And I think that's been the mark of the organisation, that we've been able to work so closely with government in working together to get something done. Peter Shergold, who's the head of the public service, said that that sort of process, those kind of partnerships, are really now part of effective governance. It has been as if the planets have lined up for us. I think most of you would agree, if you've been around for the last few days of the conference or even last night, that Australia is doing quite well in the way in which it's delivering on policies and programs for career development. I want to talk about 4 ideas: improving understanding and access, improving quality, ensuring services are available throughout the lifespan, something that Helen alluded to, and increases of accountability for service provision, maybe a bit like the Finnish model. Each is a career development challenge, so maybe let's look at how we're doing. I might start with a story. 2 weeks ago, I went to the launch of a new careers program, and there was in the audience, this kind of stakeholders that we sort of work with. There were parents, there were employers, there were students, there were unemployed, there were just the whole range, and teachers as well. But what struck me at the launch, as the speeches began, the employers raised questions about all of the acronyms they had to learn for their speech. The next speaker renamed this brand new program on 2 occasions. calling it by the wrong name the first time, a different name the second time, and you couldn't blame them. And the final speaker seemed as bemused as his audience on the jargon he was reading out. There was so much jargon, and as for the students, they'd already disengaged. And I think that notion of language is one of the things that we haven't completely addressed. People don't quite get some of the words that we're using. We use them as if people know, but if you actually say them in an audience that are not familiar with those words, then the response is, what are they talking about? You can argue that launches are meant to be sort of flat and sort of, and you know, those kind of programs are important investments and they have to be launched. And the program is a valuable contributor to connecting career development and workforce development. But our communication of that is difficult, and we need to do further work in increasing that awareness. Because if stakeholders lack a shared understanding of career development's contribution, then developing effective policy is problematic. If improving understanding is one of our policy challenges, our language needs more attention than we currently give it. And often it seems that the career development component is implied. And I think the last slide that Helen ran was that career development is implicit. And I don't think it has to be implicit. I think it should be at the front, not implicit, but stated. Career invention, and I think the other thing is that when you look at what has been done in Australia, particularly the work that has been done by the Department of Education, Science and Training, is that the work is not an expensive option for governments. Programs like a Lighthouse Schools project, placing teachers with employers, or which is an example of a program that was done in Tasmania. Those programs, and scholarships programs for teachers and various other programs, those programs aren't expensive, but they have great influence and great impact. And they are ways of government to achieve policy at a fairly low cost. If you think about the complexities facing economies in the 21st century, the pressure on national career systems and services to adapt and contribute to key national problems has arrived. And in Australia and elsewhere, career services are not yet sufficiently developed to do so, to take on this task. In Australia, as our workforce ages, from 2016 we'll have more people exiting than entering. In one decade, the average increment will drop by 50%, from 168,000 per year coming into the workforce to around 81,000 per year coming into the workforce. That's by 2026. So by in 1 year, and then by 2026, the numbers of coming in will have fallen 75%. The workforce is also ageing, and what can be done to retain them in the workforce for longer? Pressures may arise over the next few years to extend existing services to cover all age groups. School leaving ages might even be reviewed. I don't know what's saying that, but a demographer at the University of Tasmania said, watch this space. Retirement ages will increase, currently 58 in Australia, and there may be opportunities for enhanced bargaining positions of workers. If you agree that knowledge work resides in the potential of all citizens to be innovative in the use and development of their knowledge base, then career development becomes important. As knowledge economies become more sophisticated, a larger proportion of work changes from low-skilled to higher-skilled roles. And in Australia, the percentage of workers that the ABS, the Australian Bureau of Statistics, describes as knowledge workers is now more than 39% of the workforce. And it's growing by about 0.5% a year since 2000. Now that might mask the true level of what a knowledge worker is. You know, the description of the ABS is quite broad. But there remains a tide of data and opinion indicating that we need to have structures to support this group of workers. And this forms part of the country's national reform agenda. Next, in relation to skill shortages in trades and mining and manufacturing and defence, there is a role for career practitioners to play. The question of how to support the interest of the individual and the interests of employers is a topic taken up by organisational career development researchers, and it is also dealt well by the European Commission. What is evident is that career development policies need to strengthen not just the delivery systems, but the research and clearinghouse components. So to have some sort of centre for career leadership. Australia is just now considering that option of an Institute for Career Leadership. Researching and responding to these changes and developing career materials and supporting strategies to deal with these changes remains ad hoc until something like an institute is established. And don't get me wrong, I think that Australia has done remarkably well in developing a range of career programs to meet the needs of its citizens. It has taken the recommendations from the OECD review in 2002 that was undertaken by Lynne and Tony, and has sought to address many of those recommendations. The quality of information available is generally of a good standard. The delivery structures are improving with the development of Career Advice Australia, a system that's aimed at supporting the career development of 13 to 19-year-olds. And recognition of the need to support practitioners themselves has been an example of good policy and action at very low cost. Specifically, the need to develop an agreed set of standards for career practitioners across the country is a foundation that ultimately will increase confidence in the work being done by practitioners, particularly by the inclusion of a national code of ethics and clarification of the training and competencies required. We launched them on Friday. Linked to these standards are a step development of training pathways from an online training package and a certificate and a graduate certificate. In addition, in Australia, the scholarships have been put in place and to increase qualifications and to provide experience in industry. The policies and programs related to improving standards are quite cohesive and necessary to meet national challenges. Improving standards reduces the risk to policymakers in using career development to achieve national objectives. So we have some policy directions focused on reaching out to industry and reaching to build our own professional standards. We need to continue to do more outreach and inreach at the same time. Also, if standards are in place, then the staffing of a national helpline becomes viable, because in a country the size of Australia, local access to services is not easy to achieve. In the OECD definition... Sorry, 2 minutes? Oh, okay. The OECD definition, the final phrase of that definition says, and making occupational choices and to manage their careers. The question is, how do you do it? What are the services that need to be in place to help people manage their careers more effectively? What are the policies that need to underpin that? In Australia, the Australian Blueprint for Career Development is being trialled over the next 2 years, and that's one possibility, and a very good one. It takes into account some excellent work undertaken by ACCI, the Australian Chamber of Commerce and Industry, and others on employability skills, and it's hoped that the blueprint may help move Australia toward a higher degree of consistency across the country. The action taken to improve career services plays out in real time. The students who will manage their futures in the labour market of 2018 are at school now. In Australia, they will enter a very different labour market, one that is indelibly influenced by the decisions of today in newly implanted learning frameworks and perhaps enhanced by policies in Australia aimed at building human capital. I've got 1 minute. As Helen said, in Australia, when federal and state and local governments come together at the recent COAG meeting, it was to discuss a national reform agenda. A key element of reform was to strengthen the capabilities of Australian people to meet the challenges of a knowledge-based economy. How individuals decide what to learn and how to apply that learning has direct effect on the stock of human capital. In the national reform agenda, there is an overarching theme of enhancing productivity and participation. That includes transition policies from school to work, improving participation of the key groups, encouraging workforce participation, increasing the proportion of adults who have the skills and qualifications to enjoy active and productive working lives. The Career Industry Council needs to position itself as a partner and contributor to this agenda. We aren't there yet. Bodies like Seeker and hopefully the Institute can provide the focus for policy and partnerships. So what I've said is that career development has been great, but needs further development to take on important issues facing governments, employees and its citizens. And this can be achieved by improving understanding and access, improving quality of service and delivery mechanisms, ensuring services are available throughout the lifespan, increase accountability for service provision, development, policy and programs. Okay. As futurist Frank Shaw said, how might we keep open the signals of the future that are around us now? The future of the future is present. As I mentioned before, career development is not an expensive policy option for governments, but a poor quality national career development system can be. Thank you.
I didn't touch anything. I don't know. I'll see. Yes.
We're there, so just push that.
Where do I point it at?
You don't need to point it anywhere. Apparently, it's magical. It just responds.
If only guidance was so. When you're in England and you're coming to Australia for the first time, you'll say yes to anything. So I was sent this exam question through the post, email, about linking career development to workforce development. And it's like doing the exam without having been on the course. I don't quite know what those terms mean to me. And I certainly don't know what they mean to you. And I didn't even know when I said yes who would be here. So I feel quite vulnerable here, really. But I'll tell you the perspective I'm going to have a go at. We've heard a lot about the state and the citizen. I want to take two different contrasting players for a minute. The state and the employer. The employer is a kind of offside player in our conversation so far, merely the place where some of this happens. But I want to think more carefully for a few minutes with you about whether the state and the employer mean the same thing when they think about career development, and whether the state and the employer mean the same thing as each other when they think about workforce development. And because I work mostly with employers, I'm not really going to address all the issues about the whole lifespan of work development. I'm really thinking here predominantly about employed adults, the segment that we're all saying gets the least attention. And I just want to before I try and find the next slide, just say one thing about what career means for me, because I'm not a career guidance professional. So I do not think of career in terms of career guidance at all, almost. I'm learning, but not really. For me, career as defined by the OECD work, which I found incredibly helpful, is about working and learning. And so those three words for me, career, working and learning, are linked in very complex ways. And I think here we're invited to say how learning helps career. But for me, working with people in employment, the arrows back the other way are even more important. For me, not only is learning about equipping you for both your work and your longer working life, but your career and your work are most of your learning. I never say this clearly enough so that other people understand what I mean. But your career and your work is where you do the vast majority of your learning. So for me, this isn't about career development enabling workforce development. It's that much of your workforce development is in people's careers. Does anyone in the room know what I'm saying? It's not an easy thing to try and explain. On to the drivers then. My first thoughts are about what's on these two players' minds. And I'm going to say a few things about what do employers mean when they're thinking about people development in a very general way. Their predominant thought is, what's people development for? It's so I get people who can do the jobs I've got. The work I have, the projects I have, whatever word you want to use, the activities I have. And so the role of people development for the employer is primarily getting the job done with someone who's quite good at doing it. The second issue, potentially, around people development, which is much less clear and only thought about by some employers, really, is that the link between workforce development and organizational performance, which is what the employer is interested in, is partly about skills, the first word on that bracket. It's partly about having someone who has the skill to do the job, but it is also about someone who has the motivation to do the job. And there's very interesting research in the literature, not on HR, not in guidance, but the literature on high-performing organizations about the potential role of active career opportunity in motivating people to work more productively, as well as leading to them getting the skill. I want to touch on the third one, and some of the others I'll skip. There is a very widespread assumption in UK employers that if we could get the managers right, they could do the rest. So there's a very energetic concentration on leadership and management development in the UK. That's partly to make those people better managers. We have a national enormous inferiority complex about our managers. For no very good reason, actually, but we do. We like to criticise ourselves. But mostly because the assumption is that if we got the managers right, because the managers look after the people, then the people would be developed better. So that's an important assumption. Some of the others are obvious. I just want to point out with a big insurance company, the Prudential I've been working recently with, 80% of all their training activity is only to meet the regulatory environment in the UK, which is now extremely stringent around people who sell insurance. That means for their staff, training is punishment. That is what they told me. Training is not a benefit. Training is, sadly, having to do yet another exam. I think I'll just skip on. I think most of the others are obvious, but look how different the government list is. The government list is what we've already been hearing so lucidly from Australia, and in the UK it's really pretty much the same. I don't think there's anything on that list that would surprise anyone here. Our big agendas are both social inclusion, that is to prevent young people from beating up old ladies like me when we walk down the street, and productivity. And those two big levers are the ones that are driving us, and they lead to the others. They lead to the things about educational attainment, better vocational routes, employability. How am I doing for time? I'm failing to get the next. All right. I tried drawing a little 2x2 box. That's what we do when we panic. And I found I couldn't do it with a 2x2 box, so I'll just explain the boxes. Can you read that slide? Are the words big enough to see? The top row there is the employer, rather badly hyphenated. So there's a row for the employer and a row for the state. And I tried to draw a diagram with a column around workforce development and a column around career development. That was the exam question I was set. But I couldn't answer it because for me, looking in the workplace, there is a really big difference between what I mean by career development, which is all the things that help someone develop their career, and career guidance, which I've called career support on that third column, which are much more focused interventions about giving what in this room we would variously call guidance, counselling. I just call it career support because words like guidance and counselling you can't use in industry. They don't know what they mean. So I would like to say, and I'm going to say it twice, that career development for me is not career guidance. Career guidance is a small part, maybe a critical part, of career development. That wonderful story last night about a young man trying to find a job and finally getting a job, that was massive career development. I don't remember guidance in that story, but there was certainly career development going on. So let's work our way a little round the focus here. So think first about what workforce development means to employers in the UK. It means learning. It means learning for the current job. It doesn't mean learning for future jobs very much. And increasingly, it means learning near the current job. There is a serious shift to not wanting to send people on courses, not wanting to send them out of the workplace, And that is what learning theory is telling us. Learning theory is saying, do it near the job. The state sees learning in the UK at the moment almost entirely in terms of basic skills and qualifications. Blair said, he said education, 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 but what he really said is qualifications, qualifications, qualifications. They both wrestle with regulatory issues, and they both have quite good structures for training professionals. Career development, the career bit, for companies is largely about what I might call talent. It's the best and the brightest. In big firms, that's 0.5% of the workforce in their talent management program on average. And for the rest, it's the open internal labour market. It's you see a job, you go for it. For the state, so for the employer, career development is most done to the most advantaged. For the state, it is only done for the disadvantaged. It is remedial in the UK. Career development concerns are about people who are out of work, much as in Australia and in many of the other developed nations in this room. And it's about getting people back to work, single mothers in particular, and getting people into learning, brackets, whether they like it or not. Both those players are interested in career skills, but neither player really knows quite what they mean, I don't think, by career skills. Many academics know what they mean by career skills, but we don't have a very common language for, so what skills do you need to help people be good at this stuff? Career support, basically in the workplace, apart from that talent group who can get superb career support, it's do-it-yourself and some self-help. From the state's point of view, we have had many interventions with career guidance built in, but nearly always as part of another intervention, nearly always to do with a disadvantaged group. We do have Learn Direct in England, and we do have different structures in Scotland and Wales, so the UK does not have the same structures here. There's interest in labour market information in our government, but Lord knows how the public get their hands on it. You know, it's all on the web. And very limited work with and through employers. So we rely on new technology, very limited one-to-one guidance in or out of the workplace. I just want to raise some big issues, and I'll do them very rapidly. The first one is, what happens if you're neither very good nor very bad? Or in an organisation that is not strong in workforce development. The second one, oops, I've skipped two, but never mind. The second one is that in the workplace, many employers are better at thinking of equipping people for the current job, but not really the next job or the one after that. The third question in my mind is, if we're not careful, career guidance only becomes about learning. In both the employing organisation, because it's more comfortable, and for the state, which is preoccupied with qualifications and getting people into formal learning because you can measure that. And the work bit goes missing. So how much do we need qualifications? What kind of qualifications? And is that the only form of learning we're going to value? And career skills, we all know, are important. We just need to do a bit more work on that to clarify and be more consistent, and then help delivery. But we're not there with the language yet. And finally, should public career services and public training services really be in a position of advising employers at all? And if they are, then who do we have in our society who is equipped not just to deal with career guidance, but to talk to employers about these matters as well? Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, so we shall go to Dr. Mary McMahon. There we go. You're there, Mary.
Well, my role as a member of this panel is to focus on career development and some of the issues that I and my career development practitioner colleagues face as we consider our role in the 21st century and our connection with policy and workforce development, which seems increasingly more likely to happen. And in presenting to you today, I had a look at a paper presented in the first symposium held in 1999, and Mark Savakis described our attempts to find ways to strengthen national strategies for workforce development and career guidance, as well as to forge an international vision for career service delivery as a new project for career development practitioners. Well, here at Symposium 2006, the project continues and I think has become a much more imminent project to us. And it is part of the challenge in this symposium to progress our thinking in that area. And I thought it's necessary to set the challenges that face us as career practitioners into the context of our history. Our field began at a time when there was massive societal and social change. And Parsons, the father of vocational guidance, who was working at the beginning of the 20th century, was focused on achieving social justice through vocational guidance. So right from its early beginning, career development has had as its guiding tenets a focus on assisting individuals and in particular a social justice orientation towards assisting people gain entry into the workforce. And Savakis describes that as our historic mission of helping individuals adapt to societal expectations and personal transitions in their work lives. And I think that we have continued to live that mission, and I think that that mission underlies some of the issues that we face as we move closer towards connecting with policy and workforce development. Our history, our theory and our practice since that time can be traced through some key questions that were born out of societal conditions and the way in which work has been organised at various times. We will get a question here in a moment. Oh, now I've got to go back. The question at the beginning of the 20th century was, how can individuals be helped to find an occupation that fits them best? And it was that question that guided the work of Parsons and that led to his lasting legacy in the career field, that of the matching approach, which some of you may know as trait and factor, fit, or perhaps test and tell. And that approach centres around three key elements: knowing yourself, knowing about the world of work, and matching the two to find an appropriate occupation. So in that early understanding of what we did, there was a very clear link between the individual and the workforce. Again, we're living in a time of massive societal and social change. And we see individuals having to struggle as they find their way in a world of work that seems much more insecure.
Keep your finger on it a bit longer.
Okay. So to keep pace with the changing times... Oh.
Yeah, got it. It's okay. Fine.
Okay. So to keep pace with the changing times, we've had to revise our theory and practice. And the question that's guiding our practice at the moment is, how can individuals be helped to cope with multiple transitions they face during the course of their work life? So it wasn't so much that matching approach doesn't work or hasn't served us well. It's no longer adequate on its own to prepare people for the conditions that they're facing as they move into the world of work and engage with the workforce. So our theory revision is reflected in changes in the way we understand career and career development. And career, in the days of Parsons, was seen in the same way as job, occupation and vocation. But now we understand it as a much more holistic concept that involves all of our life roles, including work roles. And our understanding of career is now an inclusive one. Everyone has a career, not only those with an occupation, or more particularly, those with a professional occupation have a career. And everyone's career is different. Careers are unique and they change across the lifespan. So career development also is an inclusive, unique, holistic, dynamic and lifelong process. Career development is no longer seen as only vertical progression within an organisation, a concept that necessarily implied that some people do not have careers to develop. Development is still viewed as progression, but is seen as multi-directional and multi-levelled. It's regarded as a life journey or a pathway. And it's about individuals managing their learning and work across the lifespan. And increasingly, people are being expected to be more self-directed, proactive and strategic in the management of their career journeys. Now, I realise that in presenting these understandings that seem to be well accepted in the context that I work in and that I'm familiar with, they may not be appropriate for all people, cultures and contexts, and I think that that's a big issue that we have to face. I'm also aware that our theory revisions have moved away from the language of employers and policymakers. For example, we talk about engaging people in life career management, not about addressing skills or whatever. In presenting an overview of our history, we cannot ignore the fact that for most of it, our services have been marginalised from policymakers and also marginalised within the education system. And in recent years, there's been a growing awareness of the potential of our work as a policy tool in relation to lifelong learning, labour market and social inclusion. And it's possible that for the first time, we could move from the margins to the mainstream, which brings with it opportunities and challenge. And the fundamental challenge for us as practitioners is how we take up the potential opportunities of the mainstream while keeping the interests of our clients at heart and retaining our professional integrity. For most of our history, our emphasis has been on the private good, that is, an intense focus on individuals and what's best for them. We've paid less attention to our contribution to the public good or to the needs of employers. However, intrinsic to our work is the needs of employers and the public good. In assisting individuals to make sound decisions, we're contributing not only to their personal or private good, but also to the good of organisations for whom they work and to the public good of the society in which they live. But in general, we've not made a big thing of that role in our theory. Thus, a challenge for us as we work more closely with policymakers and other stakeholders is how we balance our focus on individuals as well as the needs of employers and policymakers. But our focus on the private good and our little involvement for our history with policymakers and other stakeholders has allowed us to be professionally self-directed and self-determining in terms of our theory and practice and research. Closer ties with workforce development and the public good will bring us under closer scrutiny, and there's evidence that that's already happening. The focus of our work, as I said, has been with individuals, but better change slides here. So some of the issues that I see as we move from the margins to the mainstream, the issue related to private and public good that I've mentioned, and also the expansion of our career development services. What does that mean if we become mainstream and our services are in much greater demand? As our services exist, they're not adequate to cope with the potential demand. But how prepared are we as practitioners to move away from the comfort zone of our traditional practices to work in new ways? We've traditionally worked in one-on-one settings or classroom settings. How prepared are we to engage in new methods, new approaches, new types of service delivery that may include the use of technology and the use of group approaches? The nature of our client group itself presents many challenges. As we've heard today, our services are going to be provided to an increasingly broad range of people, people that we haven't traditionally provided services for. So as demand for our services grow, so too does our demand to understand the needs of wider range of client groups. Our client group is becoming more culturally diverse, and I'm using culture here in its broadest context. And as I've mentioned, the way that I understand career development and career may not be appropriate in all contexts and for all people. So some issues for us as we engage with a broader range of client groups are, as individual practitioners, how can we ensure that our practice is culturally appropriate? And as a profession, as we see career development move into countries that have not had a tradition of career development, as a profession, how do we assist those countries develop career development theory and practice that are appropriate to their context without exporting what we've traditionally used? As Peter said, as we expand our service delivery and as we provide a broader range of services, our standards have come under closer scrutiny, and greater attention has been focused on the lack of standards that have traditionally existed. The development of standards, however, is a costly and time-consuming process. However, standards benefit practitioners, consumers, stakeholders like employers and policymakers, and standards serve the private and the public good. And that raises questions about whose responsibility the development and implementation of standards is, and what collaborations are possible, who funds it. Thank you. Is it the sole responsibility of practitioners, or what are the roles of other stakeholders? And how do we ensure buy-in of standards by practitioners and other stakeholders? And that raises questions about what difference will standards make, and how will we know anyway? And that inevitably leads to questions about the evidence base that underpins our practice. There's a whole session on that later in the symposium, so I won't dwell on it, except to say that it's a matter of extreme importance. So as we move towards closer links with policymakers and employers, raises questions about whose needs we're serving. Our mission has always been to provide impartial service, but as we connect more closely with workforce development and policy, we will necessarily be expected to assist and respond to labour market issues such as skill shortages. What happens if the individual goals that we're working with and the goals of employers or policy are not compatible? How do we balance the tension between the individual goals and the policy or employer goals? And that example raises questions about how we determine the worth of our work. In whose eyes will the worth of our work be judged? And whose view counts when it comes to decisions about funding and the continuation of services? We are always passionate about our work and believe in our work. Policymakers, employers have a broad range of agendas on their issue, so whose view counts? Whose goal do we serve? Is it the individual, the policymakers, or the employers? And can we serve all of them? So I see us poised on the brink of moving from the margins to the mainstream, which brings with it opportunities and challenge. And while we are tempted to grab the opportunities, we must necessarily consider the challenges related to professional integrity and our traditional focus on individuals. So perhaps our biggest challenge is how we develop a common sense of purpose, a vision in relation to career development and workforce development, which enables all stakeholders, including practitioners, policymakers, employers, organisations and the general public, to reach their potential. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary. What can a labour economist best bring to your own reflections on the peculiarities of your own profession and what it might best do. I'm sure that there is considerable intersection, but I hadn't ever wondered about this before, and I only got 12 minutes. So I'm reassured by the fact that the founder of economics, of modern economics, that extraordinary Scotsman called Adam Smith, writing in the 18th century in his outstanding book called The Wealth of Nations, observed that people who do repetitive and low-skill work become as dull and stupid as it's possible for a human creature to become. And he was making the point that our character is shaped by what we do at work. Not only our character, but our skills are shaped by what we do at work. And I think that that observation in the very beginnings of economics leads to a greater confidence that there really is a scope for a positive intersection between your world of interests and my world of interests. I want to make a couple of major points. First of all, the labour market, actually works quite well. When I say it works, I mean in delivering the types of capacities that employers want on the one hand and the sorts of jobs that workers want on the other hand. Most of that is mediated informally through the activities that go on as individuals search for jobs and as employers search for workers. And I think there is a very profound wisdom, knowledge, insight in that understanding that goes with the phrase the wisdom of crowds. It's actually quite hard to understand how individuals can work out what sort of skills they need now that's going to make them employable in 20 years' time. There is no doubt that policymakers cannot answer that question. Governments can't answer that question. Employers can't answer that question. But individuals entering the labour market have to work out an answer to that. And they do it extraordinarily well. And I think partly because of the kind of mysterious process that's summarised in that phrase, the wisdom of crowds. Yeah, people get it on the whole pretty right when they're working out what sort of things they should be looking to do. The other big question in my mind is how much does the employer support career development for individuals? And when I say that, I accept completely Wendy's fascinating statement that only about 0.5% of the workers in big companies get the benefit of active career planning from their employer. The other 99.5% have to work it out for themselves. And of course, all the people who work in small firms don't get any sort of career planning at all. Nonetheless, that suggests that employers have a trivial role in career planning. But in fact, if you think of career planning as being setting out a step-by-step pathway for an individual to follow over the whole of their working life, that's probably correct. But that, I don't think, is the best way to think about career development or career planning. Employers actually contribute an immense amount to the development of skills and consequently to the capacity to do your current job, but also to have a capacity to move to do another job. And they do it kind of by default in many cases, not by deliberately setting out to give you programs of skill development, but because you're working alongside fellow workers who know how to do the job a bit better than you do, and they share their knowledge, and you try something and you have a go and you make a mistake and you learn on the job. Some work that I did a little while ago concluded that the quantity of learning, informal learning on the job that individuals benefit from in terms of the value of that learning was considerably higher annually than the value of the formal post-school education system. So the amount of learning that happens formally or informally provided by employers is enormous and is part of what needs to be taken into account when we think about career development. Now, I do have some slides, but whether I can get to them. There's another question. Hold it down a bit longer. Now, I grappled with this idea of what is career development, being a novice to this area, and I assumed that it meant that you make progress over time to higher skilled and higher paid work. Now, that may be too narrow a definition for many of you, but one of the points I want to make is that for an audience like this, you come from all over the world. The sort of labour markets that you operate in are going to be quite varied. But the way in which people are employed is immensely important in influencing the extent to which they do get this kind of on-the-job learning informally or formally in the work that they do. And what determines more than anything the shape of the jobs that people do and the learning opportunities that they have is the structure of the economy and the ways in which people are employed. This is sort of exogenous. Nothing you people can do about that. There's not very much actually that governments can do about that either. That is just how the market evolves. And in the end, the jobs that individuals can do are determined by what's on offer from the employers. And what's on offer from the employers is determined by what is profitable for firms to do. And that is changing quite substantially. I've emphasised there, just put some numbers up about, for a little bit of comparison, about the ways in which people have worked. You might be a bit mystified as to why I've produced these numbers, but I just want to highlight that over a quarter of workers in Australia, including 16% of men in Australia, work part-time. And a comparable proportion, in fact a bit higher, work as casuals. That is, they're not on continuing expectations of employment, they're on what are formally casual terms of employment. Now that matters because employers do not invest in the skills development of casual workers in nearly the same way that they invest in the skills development of people who have continuing expectation of employment with that employer. There's been a big shift towards casual and part-time, contingent, just-in-time sort of working, and that has significant implications for what we can expect the employer to be doing in terms of developing skills. I've tried to get some comparable figures for other countries. Of course, part-time and casual are not the same thing, but there is an intersection. And I just put that up to show that Australia's a bit of an outlier in terms of casual employment. I've put there for the US, 23% of private sector workers have no paid annual leave. Now, that's a measure in Australia of casualness. If you have no paid annual leave, you're a casual, right? So it's a bit of a symptom. I don't know whether it's correct to interpret it quite the same way for the US, but it's an extraordinary figure. Okay, no paid annual leave. I thought that we were making progress in the 20th century in terms of human well-being, but a quarter of the workforce has no paid annual leave. Doesn't sound like progress. Let me just emphasise now some of the big labour market changes that have been going on, certainly in the Anglo countries and less so in Europe, and I'm afraid I can't speak much for South America and Africa and other parts of the world. But there have been very big shifts in the structure of the economy, the sorts of work that is done. Originally, of course, we were agricultural. That was an entirely different world from one where a majority of people have worked in the production of goods, manufacturing, things, tangible stuff. And that, in turn, is a different economy and forms of employment from where there's a real emphasis on the provision of services rather than stuff. And economic development can be seen as a shift from agriculture to the production of manufactured things and then finally to the provision of services. And the developed economies are now very heavily service economies and not manufacturing economies, and only a fraction, 2 or 3% of the workforce actually works in Australia and in other developed countries in primary production. Now, the types of jobs and the types of skills and the types of career possibilities are very powerfully influenced by this structural change. Services in particular tends to be either high-end jobs, right, your corporate lawyers or your merchant bankers or your real estate developers on the one hand, or it's low-level services a lot of which can be thought of as the contracting out by households of work that used to be done at home. Cleaning, feeding, caring, educating are all things that used to be done in the household that are now being contracted out in the rich countries and bought on the marketplace. Now, they're still being done by low-paid women on the whole, but now they're doing it through the market rather than doing it at home. Now, that's important because the opportunities for development, career development, for the women who are doing these low-end jobs is virtually non-existent. They do become the Adam Smiths, dull and boring and repetition, because the nature of the work that they're doing doesn't allow for that, doesn't provide opportunities for that skill development that you get in more challenging jobs. Another major thing I want to draw attention to is the changing composition of the workforce. Movement of prime-age men out of paid work, indeed out of the labour force altogether, particularly low education men, and the movement of women into paid work is one of the great social revolutions of the 20th and 21st century, and it has very big implications for what we think of as careers. So we've seen career paths in that more comprehensive sense changing quite a lot. We've seen the withdrawal of prime-age men. We see tradesmen behaving in very interesting ways. They get their trade skilled and they immediately start leaving the trades, going on to doing other things. We see increasingly people beginning post-school education for the first time in their mature and adult years. We see these older women staying in the workforce but going nowhere in terms of upward mobility. I'm running out of time and I can't get this slide to change. Oh, here we are. Sorry, I won't bother.
It's great.
Right. There's this now, because of the changes to the more casual contingent forms of employment, employers withdrawing from their traditional assumptions about the provision of skills to their workforces, and that's transferring that responsibility increasingly to the individual. And individuals, at least in Australia, are responding to that by taking up all sorts of post-school education in their mature years. And I've just got a figure there, 1 in 10 full-time workers is engaged in some form of post-school education. Now, that's a very heavy burden because you do that outside your work hours. And you're already, if you're a man, working very long hours, and then you have to go and do this other skill development stuff in your spare time. It doesn't make a lot of opportunity for family life and other important non-work activities. If we ask who gets to benefit from the sort of, no, that didn't work either, the sort of skills provision that firms do offer, particularly formal skills development, we find that it goes, as I think Wendy said, predominantly to the highly educated. Firms invest in their top-end people. They don't invest nearly as much, except for the necessity to meet licensing and other regulatory requirements, so that those that hath should be given. The more educated get the support in the workplace much more than the less educated. And also those, of course, are expected to have longer tenure in the job, and men. So if you think of this in a world where the workforce is becoming increasingly female, increasingly contingent, and has a substantial number of people working in low-end jobs, this doesn't augur well for optimistic career development or skills development for the workforce, for a sizable fraction of the workforce. This is, if we're thinking of career development as something that is important for people other than professionals. Okay, so I want to leave you just with an understanding that the context in which you're working is very strongly shaped by the macro forces that determine the structure of industry, the pressures that firms face to behave in ways that for them are profitable, and they will invest in training only when they see it as being in their interests, and there's a strong pressure, at least in the Anglo countries, towards much more contingent forms of employment, and that is bad for training if individuals don't take charge of it themselves.
Thank you very much. Well, this has been a brilliant panel. I know that one of the things that I think we've been trying to address in all of the international symposia to date, when we come at it from the hat of the career development professional or practitioner, is that often our worldviews have been too limited. We tend to not force ourselves out of our comfort zone to look at what are the labor economists telling us that we need to pay attention to. What are the people who are really working with business and their needs? What are they actually saying, and how are they shaping our field? And very often we have not pushed ourselves to really understand other bodies of research and bodies of practice so that we stretch and grow, and as Mary challenged us, change. And how do we do that with still holding on to what is our own essence and ethical practice? So I think the panel has raised certainly moved us out of our comfort zone, raised some absolutely gripping issues for us to begin to talk about. So I just want to thank all members of the panel very much for giving us a very provocative view and setting a wonderful stage for discussion that we'll move to next. So could I ask you to join me in thanking them very much?